This is a lecture on John Dewey's article, What I Believe, from 1930. My name is David Hildebrand. So let's take a quick look at the outline of the topics to come. We'll talk about some central questions and notions of faith that are involved in this question, and talk about what Dewey's idea of a faith in experience might mean. We'll discuss his diagnosis as to why people have tended to look beyond experience in the first place, and talk about some of the ways that culture has changed due to science and technology, and how that has challenged this reliance on fixity in the world through religion and other belief systems. We'll talk about what happens to religion if this idea of fixity is abandoned, and we'll talk about some of its positive potentials according to Dewey. Finally, we'll talk about why it's crucial that we not despair or give up on experience and intelligence as the central method, the central idea into which to place our faith. The age of religion is passing, Dewey says, and we cannot become nihilistic about things. We need to find a method of intelligence and compassion to find solutions to common problems. So what are the central questions in Dewey's article, What I Believe? One is whether or not religion can be naturalized and humanized. Another question is what would be kept and discarded if religion was naturalized and humanized. And the third question is what other kinds of faith could there be and why would they be worth adopting? So Dewey asks us to consider what's implied by traditional notions of faith. Well, a traditional faith is the acceptance of a definite body of intellectual propositions that are based on authority, preferably on revelation, and it's the adherence to a creed, a formal summary or articles of principles of faith that are recited in churches, recited in mosques, recited in synagogues, and other forms of worship. Pragmatism is proposing a different idea of faith, a new idea of faith. Indeed, you might say that this is an idea of faith that's so different it almost is unrecognizable as faith, but it's a place to put our hope and our energy for how to guide ourselves in the future. So Dewey's new idea of faith is, he says, faith is a tendency toward action. So the question becomes, could this be a new faith? And Dewey argues that there is a need for a faith in experience. He wants, quote, to indicate what a philosophy based on experience as the ultimate authority in knowledge and conduct means in the present state of civilization, and what its reactions are upon what is thought and what is done. For such a faith is not at present either articulate or widely held. If it were, it would not be so much a philosophy as a part of common sense. So as things stand, Dewey is arguing that our adherence to fixed doctrines implies a kind of distrust in our life experiences, and a faith in experience instead would indicate on our part a willingness to seek in experience the ends of our conduct or the ideals for our conduct, what we might traditionally just call morality. What would a faith in experience mean? What would it come to specifically? Well, at the very least, it would mean accepting a non-transcendental source of our ends and ideals. There would be no permanent neutral matrix, as Richard Rorty, the philosopher, once put it. There would be no supernatural explanations that appeal to, say, realms that lay beyond all human experience, or values that exist before or after or beyond human experience, or truth beyond all human experience. Rather, a faith in experience would mean that we not disparage experience and life, and we don't identify life with confusion or mere appearance or uncertainties or evil or hopelessness. So a faith in experience means trusting in experience, trusting that experience is the source for what we call the real, what we call the true, and what we call the good. Well, how did we get here? What is Dewey's diagnosis as to why people have looked beyond experience in the first place? It seems like a natural thing to do, to just look to your experience as your guide for various important things. Well, early on, human experience often didn't have answers or solutions to the problems that people faced. It didn't provide methods for finding answers either. And when methods are scarce, change usually means trouble. So a value came to be placed on fixity, on that which was not changing, right? That which was stable or secure. And a disvalue came to be placed on anything that was changing, because change meant lack of security. The message was, right, in the older way of thinking, look beyond the flux, look beyond the changing world for peace, for stable values, for truth. The problem is, as Dewey notes, culture has changed. Science and technology have developed tremendous tools for solving our problems, and we don't have to fear change as if we were primitive human beings. So for Dewey, science and technology are ways of solving problems, and for him, the word technology has a very particular meaning. It means physical tools and machines, of course, but it also means methods. The methods like the ones we might call scientific, the ability to observe and predict and control experience. But notice, this method, this technology, this observation, prediction, and control is not nearly as often applied to social goals, moral or political goals, as it is to physical, biological, scientific, chemical, those kinds of goals. So if you consider the kinds of debates and arguments we have about sexuality, about marriage, they're, from a scientific standpoint, rather opinionated or subjective, or, right, scientifically they're backwards, they're unintelligent. And Dewey is calling on all of us to apply a more consistent, regular, scientific in the broad sense method to our social, political, moral problems. In other words, we must be willing to deal with change, and yet fixity persists in the world, and a philosophy of experience would change this. So we have to deal with change. We have to get rid of issues about the meaning of life, or the purpose of the universe, or the right way of doing X, Y, or Z. These are questions which lead us into bitter debates and subjectivism, or even solipsism on one side, or existentialist nihilism on the other. And Dewey says, the outstanding fact in all branches of natural science is that to exist is to be in process, in change. Nevertheless, although the idea of movement and change has made itself at home in the physical sciences, it has had comparatively little influence on the popular mind, as the latter looks at religion, morals, economics, and politics. In these fields, it is still supposed that our choice is between confusion, anarchy, and something fixed and immutable. It is assumed that Christianity is the final religion. It is assumed that our present economic regime expresses something final. It is assumed, in spite of evident flux in the actual situation, that the institutions of marriage and family that developed in medieval Europe are the last and unchanging word. These examples hint at the extent to which ideals of fixity persist in a moving world. A philosophy of experience will accept at its full value the fact that social and moral existences are, like physical existences, in a state of continuous, if obscure, change. It will not try to cover up the fact of inevitable modification, and it will make no attempt to set fixed limits to the extent of changes that are to occur. So instead, Dewey is saying we need to take a pluralistic approach. We need to take a pluralistic approach to help make meanings in life. He says, consider the place occupied in popular thought by the search for the meaning of life and the purpose of the universe. Men who look for a single purport and single end either frame an idea of them according to their private desires and tradition, or else, not finding any single such unity, they give up in despair and conclude that there is no genuine meaning and value in any of life's episodes. The alternatives are not exhaustive, however. There is no need of deciding between no meaning at all and one single all-embracing meaning. There are many meanings and many purposes in the situations with which we are confronted, one, so to say, for each situation. Each offers its own challenge to thought and endeavor and presents its own potential value. End quote. So many little sweetnesses in our lives are possible once we dispense with the suffocating monism, the idea that there is one meaning of life, or one way to be spiritual, or one economic approach, or one way to love another person, or one way to be a family, and so forth. This striving for a single way in any of these various areas is, in fact, Dewey says, a waste of energy, which could be much more productive if it was more flexible and attuned to the various situations as they come up. He says, belief in a single purpose distracts thought and wastes energy that would help make the world better if it were directed to attainable ends. One question which is raised by Dewey's proposal is what becomes of religion? Must it be dismissed entirely if we accept faith in experience? Well, almost. We have to get rid of supernaturalism, which bears with it the tension between religion and science, and we have to get rid of fixed dogmas and rigid institutional rules and codes that enforce those dogmas or bring people back to those supernaturalist beliefs. But getting rid of these do not address the greatest damage, which is done by inflexible and tradition-bound religions. From Dewey's standpoint, the main threat from religion is its tolerance of forces that are destructive of experience and growth. That is, their acceptance of conventional institutions and practices. He writes, as I read human nature and history, the intellectual content of religions has always finally adapted itself to scientific and social conditions after they have become clear. I do not think that those who are concerned about the future of a religious attitude should trouble themselves about the conflict of science with traditional doctrines, because the chief danger to religion lies in the fact that it has become so respectable. It has become largely a sanction of what socially exists, a kind of gloss upon institutions and conventions. Primitive Christianity was devastating, right, to the traditions that it attacked, in its claims. Unfortunately, since the Western world is now alleged to be Christianized, right, in the main, a world of outworn institutions is accepted and blessed. End quote. So in other words, Dewey is saying that the tendency to just ride along with the old religious assumptions affects us by getting people accustomed to accepting the status quo in other areas where change is badly called for by changing circumstances. For example, our acceptance of the runaway materialism or consumerism of capitalism, the injustice of economic systems, including the injustices of capitalism, where many people are poor and a few people are rich, the injustices of nationalism and patriotism, the injustices of militarism of many national states who prepare for war instead of for peace. And of course, these critiques could be leveled at other systems, communism, socialism as well. Any system which is clinging to fixed ideas, which is resulting in injustice, is supported by religion because they simply nod and wink at it as they continue to hold on to their own dogmatic positions. Now, Dewey did think that there was a positive potential that religion had, and it was religion's ability to adapt so as to promote the growth of human experience and help people survive. So Dewey thought that religions might really apply themselves to the world in which people live, use their power, their communication with the people who follow the religion to say, do an economic critique, ask, what is the economy doing to working people? Dewey writes, a genuinely religious attitude will be concerned with all that deeply affects human work and the leisure that is dependent upon the conditions and results of work. That is, it will acknowledge the significance of economic factors in life instead of evading the issue. The greatest obstacle that exists to the apprehension and actualization of the possibilities of experience is found in our economic regime. End quote. So the alternative, of course, if religions don't do this, is for religions to react to such circumstances, right, of exploitation or alienation, poverty, by just digging into their own dogma. So as a wealth gap increases in an economic sections of society, maybe fundamentalism goes up and people start banging the religious book harder and louder. There's more clinging to the past, more clinging to easy answers, more scapegoating of other people. So in the face of these ineffectual solutions in this digging in process, people become more powerless and they distrust solutions in their experience. They distrust the very solutions that their experience is telling them to try, and they either support perhaps political extremism or they devote more prayer to justice in the afterlife, say. So because we rely on religion for morality, or let's put it this way, a lot of people read the moral rules of their own life off of the religious rules that they are brought up with. This should also be in transition. The fixed rules and ends of religions are not enough, Dewey says. And what we need to do is we need to sift through our actual experience, and we need to communicate with one another about those experiences and about our methods for solving problems. He says, quote, "A new and effective approach to morality can emerge only from an exploration of the realities of human association, one in which there is sifting and communication of the results of all relevant experiences of human association." End quote. So if you think about what is implied by the results of all relevant experiences, you think, well, yes, we need to hear the stories. We need to tell the stories of the experiences of people whose stories have not been told or not been featured, the people who have been marginalized. This, in our society, would include women, people of color, those in economic poverty, the disabled, and many others. Physical sciences, just for contrast, they note every detail that they can find in a problem-solving operation or in a scientific inquiry to see if it's relevant to the complete picture and the solution down the road. Taking a more scientific approach, quote-unquote scientific approach to morality, would be just as open-minded for empirical reasons, and the results would be an improvement in everyday morality because those results would be read back into and applied into experience. Just consider as one example abandoning a one-sided approach to gender. It would have real positive impacts. Dewey says, talking about the situation as he found it, which in some ways sounds similar, present ideas of love, marriage, and the family are almost exclusively masculine constructions. Like all idealizations of human interests that express a dominantly one-sided experience, they are romantic in theory and prosaic in operation. In other words, prosaic in operation meaning they have real consequences when we are raised on the masculine idea of what love is, what romance is, or how the family should operate, rather than taking our cues from what's actually happening in contemporary life around us. So we can't despair or give up on experience and intelligence, Dewey says. Often we despair because our problems are still unsolved. We despair because humans seem driven by emotion, driven by our habits. But he says emotion and habit can be made more intelligent. We can rethink how we do things. We can rethink our habits. We can think about how we react to things. And we can change our life through these kinds of inquiry. The shock of technology, the change around us, the scientific changes, these are temporary. We can get used to them. But we need intelligent direction of our values in order to change the world in an important way. One thing Dewey is asserting, similar to what others have noted, philosophers such as Nietzsche, Stace, Baer, and many others. Religion is becoming more and more unbelievable as people in general become more and more familiar and comfortable with the methods and processes of science. Dewey writes, "Such a phenomenon is, however, transitory. The impact of the new forces is for the time being negative. Faith in the divine author and authority in which Western civilization confided, inherited ideas of the soul and its destiny, of fixed revelation, of completely stable institutions, of automatic progress, have been made impossible for the cultivated mind of the Western world. It is psychologically natural that the outcome should be a collapse of faith in all fundamental organizing and directive ideas." End quote. So as we saw, one reaction to the shaking of these foundations, these religious and spiritual foundations, is retreat. Retreat into racism, into sexism, into the supposed glory of the past, and the sentimental and revolutionary urge to make everything great again. This is the kind of propaganda that leads to a situation in which, as Dewey puts it, nationalism is elevated into a religion called patriotism." End quote. But Dewey is concerned that we not become nihilistic skeptics, that in the process of turning away from fixed ideas and religious dogma that we just become skeptical or nihilistic. He says we need a philosophy of experience, a coherent body of ideas that are both critical of other ideas and constructive of new ones, that can organize our outlook, organize our interpretations and inform them with new ideas, imaginations, and constructions of experience that help us solve problems and develop new visions. He writes, "It is in such a context that a thoroughgoing philosophy of experience, framed in the light of science and technique, has its significance. For it, the breakdown of traditional ideas is an opportunity. The possibility of producing the kind of experience in which science and the arts are brought unitedly to bear upon industry, politics, religion, domestic life, and human relations in general is itself something novel. It is a faith, but the conception of it as a possibility, when it is worked out in a coherent body of ideas, forms a philosophy, an organized attitude of outlook, interpretation, and construction. It can be tried and tested only in action." So this concludes the lecture on John Dewey's What I Believe. I am David Hildebrand. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking with you about it soon.